So I've been using the Fujifilm X-T3 for the last 2 years now, and over that time, my initial impressions of the camera have changed so much. Not just from the experience of using it and getting to know the camera, but also because the camera itself was also changed over that time too. So while I may be replacing this camera, in this video I wanted to talk about the things that I've absolutely loved about the Fujifilm X-T3 and still love about it, the things that potentially I believe could be improved on the camera, and of course if you're looking to purchase a camera like this, hopefully you're going to find some considerations to think about as well, whether this camera is right for you or not. So the first thing with this camera that I absolutely loved is just the tactile and physical nature of using it. I think it's a very tangible experience using a Fujifilm camera, and it's something I think they pride themselves on, is just having access to the physical buttons and dials to change the settings, rather than having to dig through menus. Now, of course, for video related things, you generally will maybe find yourself going through the menus a fair bit, but you can sort of create a custom menu, which is great, so I've got all my favorite settings there. But otherwise, just going ahead and sort of changing the aperture by rotating the cuff on the lens or adjusting the ISO by moving a dial, and actually physically seeing that dial as well, I think has been a really great experience. I've just always loved picking up and using this camera. The build quality is second to none as well. It's a very solid feeling camera. Again, I just feel like I'm very confident using this. Of course, I don't want to drop it, but again, it feels like it's a camera that's designed for some serious work that's going to stand the test of time. The next thing is recording options. Now, this is where this camera still shines 2 years later. We're now in 2020, December 2020. In December of 2018, I purchased this camera, and we're talking about a time where the A7 III was out, the EOS R was out, and these both had 8-bit 420 internally, and the Fujifilm X-T3 had 10-bit 420 internally and 10-bit 422 out. It's really one of those cameras and those amazing cameras that kind of paved the way for 10-bit 422 internal to become the standard these days. Back then it was just a standout camera that could do this kind of stuff. And not only just record 10-bit 422, it could also do DCI as well, and still can do DCI obviously, 4K up to 60 frames a second, 400 megabits per second. This camera's insane. And again, continues to be these days. It has not been replaced, has not been superseded. We're not talking about, again, 8-bit codecs these days, which a lot of people are trying to move away from if they're doing some more serious video work and they want to do a little bit more color grading. That's when your 10-bit's really going to help you out. And this camera from day dot has had 10-bit internally, which is, as I said, it's incredible that, again, Fujifilm were able to do this for this camera, include things like DCI 4K. It's one of those great things about Fuji because they don't have a cinema line of cameras like the other brands do, Sony and Canon, where they don't really have to protect that particular camera and that lineup. So therefore, we are talking about things like DCI 4K on this small little camera, which even the A7S III, I believe, doesn't have. You'd have to go to an FX6 in order to get the DCI 4K. And again, same thing with Canon and their cameras. You're generally having to go to a cinema line camera in order to get the DCI 4K. But in this case, you can actually use it just internally on the Fujifilm X-T3 with a slight crop. And if you need it, I think it's pretty amazing. Now, one of the things that I guess has been a little bit of a challenge over the years on this camera is autofocus. Now, again, depending who you watch on YouTube and who you sort of see, whether you're looking at this camera for photography or for video, the autofocus is extremely quick. There is absolutely no doubt about this camera being very fast when it comes to focusing and finding focus. Again, I can only speak from my experience on the one lens, which I'll talk about a bit later, but for the most part, I found this camera is always generally pretty quick in terms of autofocus. Whether it's accurate is another thing, and especially with video, it has continually gotten better. In fact, if I made this video about a month or two ago, before Fujifilm released a major update for the X-T3, I would tell you that the autofocus on it is just a little bit, it's just not so reliable. I actually used it for a job and I had it on a gimbal, and it was sort of a very complicated scene in the sense that was surrounded by greenery. There was a lot of obviously small details, grass, water, and the camera's autofocus was just kind of losing it. It could barely find something. It had the face sort of detection turned on. It could find someone's face, but as soon as I turned away, it would constantly jump back and forth from the background, even though all my settings were kind of set to the slowest autofocus possible. It almost just felt like the camera was bugging out, and to be honest, that's been my experience a little bit throughout the years. If it doesn't agree with a scene, it's really going to struggle. And so therefore, I would suggest that the autofocus for video hasn't been that reliable. However, Fujifilm recently released an update where they kind of brought the Fujifilm X-T3 to the same level as the X-T4, which is the newest version of the camera that Fuji have released. And that to me is absolutely incredible. And I think it just speaks volumes about Fujifilm as a company. The fact that they were willing to do that for an older camera. I'm used to, this is the Canon C200 I'm shooting on at the moment. This camera is never getting an update again, I feel. It's had a lot of minor updates over the years, but the way this camera came originally, that's what you get. You bought it, as newer features come out, Canon's not looking back. They've got newer cameras in the pipeline. They probably don't care about these older cameras anymore. You bought it, you use it, you're happy with it, great, go for it. Whereas Fuji are constantly trying to improve even their older style cameras if they can, and that to me just puts a lot of confidence in the company. And it actually has made a big difference. I've been using the X-T3 and I shot a little bit of a little vignette. We're supposed to actually take some photos on this particular day. We went out and shot some video, and the autofocus just felt way more reliable, and I could feel it was way more predictable than I'd experienced in the past. And that was a big confidence booster for me. I feel like Fujifilm may have addressed a lot of issues that I've had with the camera with one of these latest firmware updates. The next thing I want to talk about, and people love to rave about, is the profiles on the camera. And this is something really interesting to me because I've used a lot of cameras in the past, and of course they all have these internal picture profiles you can kind of change. Do you want like a black and white effect? Do you want a sepia effect? And as someone who doesn't really use that kind of stuff, because of course, I'm not the person to be like, whoa, you know what? Sony's decided this is a great sepia effect. I want to shoot my entire film like this. Of course, you generally want to shoot as flat as possible. That's my ethos anyway, and kind of bring it in later on and make those creative decisions to make sure that you can dial in exactly what you want. But Fujifilm have this kind of unique advantage where they've developed film over a number of years, and now they've kind of making these profiles that emulate those film stocks. And as a result, you're kind of getting not just a filter that's this sort of generic sepia or black and white filter, but these really nice profiles which kind of emulate these older film stocks. And of course, a Turner is the most popular. You've probably heard of it before if you're looking into the Fujifilm cameras. A Turner is kind of this more flat look where again, the shadows are a little bit lifted. And it just sort of, if you do need a look in a pinch, I feel like it's just a great option to have on the camera. And although I haven't shot a lot of things just for example, in a Turner or in a certain picture profile, when you do need it, they're there in a pinch, and to be honest, they look quite good compared to a lot of other cameras which just have these generic picture profiles, and you're like, I'm never going to use these because they look absolutely terrible. So battery life on this camera is also not super great. It's not as great as obviously some of the newer mirrorless cameras out there, but that's to be expected. The X-T4, I believe, has better battery life too. You'll definitely see this most when using the camera for extended periods of time. For example, if I'm recording these direct-to-camera YouTube videos, they could take a little while. If I'm shooting with the X-T3, I'll probably have to swap out the battery once over that period of time. So I would suggest that it's not great, but if you have a few batteries, you'll get through. So audio is also really interesting as well. The camera doesn't have the best preamps, so you really want to make sure you're using it with a microphone that has a lot of gain that it can send to the camera. That's something like a Rode Video Mic Pro, which does have sort of these adjustable gain knobs or dials if you can. And that's really going to help you out, because then you can kind of do that heavy work and heavy lifting on the mic itself and not force the camera to do it. When I first started using it, I used a Rode Video Micro, just because I wanted a really small setup, and that's the only sort of external camera mic that I had on me at the time. And I really had to boost up the gain in the camera, and it was super noisy. I actually thought the preamps were broken, but it's just because the Rode Video Micro doesn't send a lot of signal, and you really have to boost that up from the camera itself. So if you can, make sure you're using a microphone that does have a lot of gain. I've used a Rode Wireless Lab system, and again, that has adjustable levels too, so that's been really great. But again, keep the levels down to about -12 or below. You don't want to go any higher than that, or too much higher than that, I should say, because then you will start introducing more and more noise, which you might have to correct out later on. Now, the last thing I want to quickly cover with the X-T3 is lenses in general. Now, Fujifilm lenses are so highly regarded because they do, I guess, Fuji are very, very focused on the quality of their lenses. And in fact, probably to a fault for videographers, because they are so sharp and probably so clinical looking. I've got the 16 to 55mm on my Fujifilm X-T3, which I've loved as a lens. I think it's just a very high quality lens. It's very hefty. In fact, it's probably too hefty again, because when you're putting on a gimbal, you actually need to put some counterweights behind the camera so it can balance properly. But otherwise, the quality of the lens itself is really high. it's probably just for a lot of shoots, especially if you're doing more narrative film stuff, it's gonna be way too sharp. It's gonna have that TV kind of over sharpened look. For photography, I could imagine this is amazing, and I have used it obviously for photos as well. The resolving power of the lens itself is incredible. And Ken Rockwell, if you've ever read his reviews, he just loves to rave about Fujifilm lenses being really top quality. Now, a downside to that is Fuji sort of focusing more on quality means that they don't have a huge amount of lenses in their lineup that have optical image stabilization. Because as you may know, when you sort of put that technology into a lens, sometimes you are compromising on the quality aspects of it, and especially Fujifilm's higher end lenses that are kind of the equivalent to your Canon L series or Sony G Masters. These lenses, generally speaking, don't have optical image stabilization. So it's really helpful to have internal sort of IBIS in the camera itself. The X-T3 doesn't have that, the X-T4 does. So if you are someone who I guess shoots a lot of handheld video and you are gonna look to sort of invest in Fujifilm as a lens and as a system, I'd probably go for a camera these days like the X-T4, which does have internal IBIS. Otherwise, you may find, of course, that you're gonna need to put the camera on a gimbal. Lastly, there's a few small gripes with the camera, some of which have been fixed, thankfully. The first one was, please update your firmware, because previously on Fujifilm cameras, if you didn't have an SD card in them and you turn on the camera, it would show you no memory card. Now, if you missed this and you started recording, the camera would behave normally, like it was recording, and then you'd hit the stop button and you'd realize that you just lost a shot, which was super frustrating. Thankfully, in the new firmware, when you press the recording button, it doesn't do anything, which is great, and then you have to work out that you don't have an SD card in there. It doesn't have a flip out screen, which is fine. The X-T4 does, so if you do a lot of content creation like I am right now staring at a camera, and you're filming yourself, a flip out screen might be absolutely great in that particular instance. To wrap this up, the Fujifilm camera has just been absolutely incredible. I've loved using it over the last 2 years, and I'm very sad to be selling the camera because at the end of the day, it's still a great camera. It's mainly just that it doesn't match particularly well with the camera that I'm shooting with right now, which is the Canon C200. 2 different camera brands, 2 different sort of color sciences. Absolutely amazing in terms of, again, image quality. Both of them together are great, but very different cameras. And if you are someone who's just sort of looking to do a bit of photography, videography, I think the Fujifilm cameras are just a great hybrid. You've got a camera that's still got quite a large sensor in terms of photography, photography-wise, but you've also got a camera that can do internal DCI 4K 10-bit, which I think, again, I'm still applauding 2 years later because I think it's just not something that has become the standard, and Fuji have just done so much work on this camera post me buying it, which, to be honest, I just haven't had that experience with other camera manufacturers. Canon. Sorry, got something in my throat. So hopefully you've enjoyed this video and you've learned something new if you are looking to buy a Fujifilm X-T3 camera. It's got my recommendation, it's got my tick of approval. I've used this thing for the last 2 years, and I think anyone who's gonna use it to create video content can create some amazing stuff with it. So thank you to everyone for watching. Please leave a comment down below, and of course subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the content, and I'll see you in the next video.